Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the PyCon conference. Today it's Richard Landers speaking to us about learning to speak a common language with BDD, Behavior Driven Development. Richard, over to you.
Cool, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Landers. I'm a software developer at Afrolabs. My talk today is a personal account of how and why we implemented behavior-driven development for a new customer. I'll be talking about our decision to use BDD, as well as giving a live demo on how we used it at Afrolabs. Afterwards, I'll briefly take you through the different stages of implementation and my own takeaways from this. So I think a great place to start would be to probably talk about this new customer and what they do and what problems they were looking to solve. But before that, though, I thought it might be cool to share two other products we have worked on. Just share quite quickly. The reason I want to share them is they were both built in Python on Google App Engine, and this is PyCon, so it'll be a great place to share. So briefly, we have Cowabunga. We had help build a part of Checkers 6060, which gets orders to where they need to be. So basically just the delivery stuff. Then we have TapeAids, which is a non-for-profit organization dedicated to providing one of the world's most extensive audio libraries aimed specifically for blind people. But yes, back to the customer that has actually sort of helped inspire this talk, and they're called Go Metro. So who is Go Metro? They are a company. We are incredibly passionate about transport and logistics in both the public and private sectors, and how they can use tech to solve problems in this space. They have already actually taken products to market. As you can see, they've got a product called Fleet. They've also got a sort of an app for tracking buses or bus schedules. So yeah, where do we fit in this? Where does Afrolab sort of fit in this puzzle? So Go Metro was looking for a dev team to help them build out a new version of one of their existing products, as they felt that the product could no longer support all of which they had learned along the way. So what we had was a relatively well-defined picture of what they needed to build. There was obviously still a consideration that things still could change, as most things often do at this sort of stage in a product as life cycle. But yeah, for the most part, we had a great sense of what boxes needed to be ticked in order to get something to production. So something we had adopted in our early discussions when talking to Go Metro was to take a domain-driven design approach. This was the first time I had actually used DDD. It is important to mention, as this was the segue into how we started using behavior-driven development, as domain-driven design often lends itself to understand required behavior. Sorry, I'm tripping over all the DDDs and BDDs, and there's so many different DDDs out there. But yes, so BDD. What is BDD or behavior-driven development? BDD was pioneered by Daniel North in the early 2000s, and as he describes it himself, it is an outside-in methodology. It starts at the outside by identifying business outcomes and then drills down into the feature set that will achieve those outcomes. Each feature is captured as a story, which defines the scope of the feature along with its acceptance criteria. So what did we use to implement BDD? A Python library called Behave with an exclamation mark. I don't know, probably an Austin Powers joke somewhere in there. I'm not going to make it. I might have already accidentally made it by bringing it up, but I didn't put the exclamation mark there. I think that's my point. Which is now a great time to actually talk about cucumber and gherkin, or as pickled cucumbers, the my bad joke, which is maybe worse than an Austin Powers joke. Just slide 8. So Cucumber. Cucumber is a software tool which supports behavior-driven development, originally based off of a tool developed in 2005 called RSpec. One of the creators of RSpec, Aslak Hillesoy, had a lot of ideas for improvements, which ultimately resulted in him creating Cucumber. The same developer behind Cucumber is also the inventor of Gherkin. So what is Gherkin? It is described as a formal language for capturing software requirements. Although it's not necessarily the only way to do BDD, it is often the most common way of doing BDD. In fact, it's the only way I know how to do BDD. So sorry. So this is there's something often referred to as the Gherkin syntax, and as you can sort of see in the slide here, Gherkin uses a set of special keywords to give structure and meaning to executable specifications, which I will show you shortly in a little demo I'm going to give. Each keyword is translated to sort of many spoken languages. The primary keywords used when using Gherkin are feature, rule, example, given, when, then, and, but, background, scenario outline, or scenario template, examples, or scenarios. I probably fired those off very quickly. I apologize, but yeah, I can always share links afterwards. Personally, though, from my own side, I've only ever actually dabbled in feature, scenario, given, and when, then. Okay, so now we had a tool. So what happened next? So now we had to actually go and define the scenarios and features, which brings me to one of the biggest benefits to using an actual spoken language to define features in this way, as it allows for everyone on the team to help collaborate on product development, which is where I think the real magic of BDD lives. So this is something I stumbled across while reading a blog the other day, which is an agile concept known as the Three Amigos, which refers to, as you can see, there's three dudes, whatever. You got business, often named the business analyst or product owner. The business role provides what problems must be solved. They provide requirements for the solution. Typically, the business role is non-technical. Then we've got development. The developer role provides how the solution to the problem will be implemented. They build the software and must be very technical. Testing. The testing role, sometimes named quality assurance, verifies that the delivered software product works correctly. They also try to find defects. The tester role must be somewhat technical. So BDD is an enhancement of this concept, as BDD encourages and fosters collaboration between technical and non-technical members of a team when writing out scenarios, as scenarios are usually simple, high level, and written in plain language. So what I'd like to do now is a demo, the general workflow of how we went about implementing BDD. I wasn't actually going to give a demo, but David Campy shared this great quote with me from the creators of SpecFlow and the Cucumber for Java, Seb Rose and Kashper Naik. I'm a big believer of the phrase show, don't tell, especially as it relates to software development. Many experts are constantly telling us what we should be doing, but offer very few examples that actually show us how to do so. Probably worth mentioning that I do not consider myself an expert though, but yes, let me get to the demo now. So I'm just going to stop sharing quickly. Seconds. Okay. Cool. So let me zoom in. So what we have in front of us here is actually a feature file. So if you remember that last slide, we had that feature file. This is so actually before that, probably worth mentioning that this is a project that I've already set up beforehand, just to kind of save a bit of time. So yes, I've already installed Behave, as you can see here. It's already come installed. We have, like I said, this is a sort of a demo feature that you can actually get off the Behave website. The feature is showing off BDD scenario, run a simple test. We have Behave installed. When we implement a test, then Behave will test it for us. So worth mentioning, as I mentioned earlier, that these are actual executable lines. So when I run the test, it's going to sort of want to execute these lines, and how it executes these lines. In the steps folder, I've got a tutorial.py, which, as you can see, imports Behave. And then we've got a given, when, then, with obviously that wording, which you saw in the feature file. Sorry, let me zoom in as well. So if we run the test, it passes. Yeah, cool. So we kind of can see what Behave does by doing that. Obviously, these tests are not exciting at all. And just while I've got this open just so you guys are, just to mention this. So as you see, this is context. Context is an object which gets handed down to each step. And you can use it to store and share information as it holds the contextual information during the execution of the test. So what I would actually like to do now, which I think could be quite cool, or maybe not, is just walk you through how a feature file generally gets brought to life, or at least how we did it at Apple Labs. And this process usually doesn't begin in the code. I mean, technically it probably could, but we found it a lot easier to get all the amigos in a room, and by room I mean a virtual room, and discuss the features and scenarios in depth while writing them out in some sort of doc. So I'm just going to pretend that Notepad++ is our doc. So before I begin, as well, just a quick context of what feature I would like to build here today with you is a watered down version of a feature we had actually built for Go Metro. And by watered down, I just mean the Python powering it. So this feature is called adherence. And one of the scenarios for the adherence system was to monitor bus arrivals and to create some form of event or alert for an operator, letting them know that a bus was on time or late. So generally the first where we'd begin is, like I said, we'd all get in a room and we'll start discussing. So as I've already just outlined, I think the feature we'd like to build today is called adherence. So you can give it a description. I'm probably not. Oh my gosh. So now I can start. So we've got a feature. Now we can start creating scenarios. So I think the first scenario I'd like to create is a sort of a happy path scenario. So I want to check that the bus is on time. So I'm just going to say bus arrived at the first stop on the northbound duty on time. I can start off my scenario. So now these executable lines. So given the northbound duty and the 101 bus, so I'm in this test, I'm passing in an existing duty, which will obviously have stops in it, and I'm telling it about a bus that we care about. And the bus is at, so I'm obviously not going to be using any kind of real location stuff, so let's just pretend that this tuple is a lat long. This will all probably make a bit more sense when I actually move it over into the Python side. So now we've got our bus, we've got a duty, and we've got a location for the bus. So when it is the first stop, let's see if the bus is there. We're going to do our adherence check. We're going to check the time, and then we're going to see if they're at the first stop. Then, so this is where you can do your asserts and also just see if something is what it's meant to be. So now there should be an event to say they arrived on time for the first stop. Can also quickly then, actually, I'll get back to that. So we've got a happy thing. I was going to also do like a bad path, but I do already have it somewhere. Just move in. So now we've got a scenario. This takes a lot longer than that to build. It is, like I said, a lot of collaboration that needs to happen, discussions, back and forth, arguments, the usual stuff that happens when talking about features. So now we've got our first feature file, called adherence, and we've got a scenario. So now we want to actually go and move that over into the code now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a feature file, and that obviously ends in a .feature. So I'm just going to call this adherence.feature. So as you can see, obviously whatever, then just kill that. I can then now move this over into here, and boom. So like I said, I've already created the skeleton for this test. That's why it's all nice, and I'll explain now what the blue is. But for example, if you don't have the, sorry, let me zoom in again now. If you don't have the executable line, it'll still gray out. So as you can see, these are not grayed out because I already do have them here. So I have built the skeleton in preparation for this demo because otherwise it would have taken a lot more time. You can see I'm got some imports already set up. So what was that blue writing you saw now? So importing this use-step matcher, which allows us to use regex in the actual executable line. So we can actually pass it variables. The reason why I'm doing that, also have these just random data sets here of to predict. So we've got the duties, we've got a northbound, a southbound with locations and ETAs, and same with the vehicles. just to kind of show off the fact that you can obviously play around with different variables and pass in different sort of data, or at least fetch it on the other side. So now, yeah, so we've got our scenario, and now we've got our sort of Python runner, the Python behind it, wanting to power it. So obviously, if I run the test now, I'm expecting nothing, because, well, there is nothing. I mean, cool. So now if I want to quickly build out this test, so what can I do? So first thing we're doing, as we can see here, we're passing in the duty. So as mentioned earlier about the context object, I want to save that to the context object because we're going to use it later on in text. So what I can do is I'm going to context.duty equals, obviously the way I've set up my data, I'm going to have to just do a quick filter over it. We've got our duty in our test. So when we run our test, we'll at least be saving a duty against the context object. We're doing absolutely nothing with it now. So I'm just going to copy this just to save some time. And similarly, same story. I'm just going to obviously be fetching a bus now. So cool. So now we've got a duty, our bus. And now we want to update the bus's location. So we can just go bus.
Richard, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
Can you try and zoom in a bit?
Sorry, I've been warned about that, and I apologize.
Thank you.
Sorry, everybody. Yes, so now, yeah, so we're updating the bus's location. Like I said, this is still a string though, so I'm just going to convert it back into a tuple by doing this. Cool. So now we've got our data. So now we're going to do the adherence check. So same situation. We want to get the stop because we're going to check the stop now. Because if I go back to my duties, we can see we've got our stops over here. So we've got a first stop and a second stop. And the specific test we're running now, we're obviously going to be looking at the first stop, but we still need to fetch it. So again, sorry, I'm just going to copy this again. And because we're pulling it out of the duty that we already have saved in our context, so it'll be like that. So now we've got a stop. I'm gonna, if you notice on the vehicles, there's this event. So I'm just gonna populate this with an event. So I can just start. Obviously, there's a lot of assumptions happening here right now that should not be happening, but obviously for the sake of the demo. So now there's a very ugly if statement, which I just threw here because I didn't want to have to type this ugly if statement out again. And oh, that does not translate nicely, but just so you can see what's happening here is we're obviously checking the time that we're getting in here. We're comparing it to the stops ETA, and then we're checking the bus's location, comparing it to the stops location. And then what I'm going to do is just update it. So if true, we can very badly assume that he's arrived. Like I said, there's a lot of other assumptions happening here that should not be happening. And then similarly, if this doesn't happen, we can assume he's late, which is, like I said, as well. More other things that could be happening here or other. And then we can actually update the event. Cool. So now we've got this very basic adherence check happening here. So now this is the then. So you can see I've got two here because, like I mentioned, there's a negative one, but I might not be able to get to that depending on the time I have available. But yes, so there should be an event to say they arrived on time for the first stop or stop name. So again, sorry, just bear with me as I copy paste this line yet again. So now we just want to go and look for the event associated with the bus. So yes, stop name, stop bus, events, and just so we can actually see something, I'm just going to print out what we get. Bus event. So we can see what we get. That's it. So now we can do the assertion, so we can expect something back here. So now I'm expecting an arrived in event type. So what happens now if I go back here and I run this test. Bus event arrived. Again, I can probably change his location and it will probably fail. And assume he's late. Because technically he is late, I guess, because he isn't where he's meant to be. So yeah, that's a very basic example. Like I said, I do have the late one, which is effectively just a copy paste of this one, except asserting for a different outcome. Yeah, so that is the general gist of BDD or Behave. I mean, like I said, there's a lot more that happens behind the scenes before you even get to this point. But yeah, that's basically have it. And this is a real world example. I'm just going to go back to my slides quick. Sorry, 2 seconds. Well, yeah, so what you actually have in front of you, just to kind of really sort of drum that in, is that, yes, that was more or less a real world example of what we did for Go Metro. And this is actually just a quick screen grab of one of the earlier adherence stuff we actually did for them. Yeah, and this is what we did for the first few months of the build, which was really weird. Weird because usually we have, somebody approaches us, there's a problem that needs solving, or there's an idea, and that sort of helps motivate us to immediately start discussing tech and how it should be implemented. And that's where we dive in. We just immediately start diving in and start building based on those initial assumptions without really kind of fleshing it all out and connecting all the dots together. But now with BDD, we were intentionally moving slow, and I really want to emphasize the intentionally moving slow part. It was really, really weird. It's like, okay, we've got a feature file. Let's jump into the code now. Like, no, obviously David was definitely the what's the word? Like keeping the whole thing together, making sure that we were sort of on this path and sticking to this path that we sort of agreed upon, which was the BDD sort of approach. Yeah, and this period, I'll be honest and say there was a lot of anxiety from me, because as you can imagine, we had such a thin slice of code and just a whole lot of feature files with tests, and we had such a lightweight approach to this build. What I mean by that, we were constantly avoiding tech decisions. We only implemented a database much later into the build, once we actually had a proper sensible grasp of what the data should look like based on these feature files. Which sort of leads me to also a sort of profound moment while using BDD. So every week we would have a review session with the CEO of Go Metro, along with other senior employees, and it would literally feel like all we were showing them was this, which was the cause of my anxiety, right? Usually we have okay, sprints, 1 week, 2 week, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the sprints, there's something to show, and what I mean by that, tangible, but there's a fancy thing going on here. I can click a button and something appears. Oh, wow, cool. That's how we sort of were used to doing things. But I was wrong, really, really wrong. And also just to kind of re-quote the quote from earlier, show, don't tell. And that's exactly what those feature files were doing for the CEO of Go Metro and all the other parties involved. It was showing them that we were all aligned and that we were building the right things that needed to be built. But still, at the same time, I still had that strong desire to show something tangible. I mean, I really just wanted to put a bus on a damn map for the longest of time. And finally, we got to obviously put a bus on a damn map. Yeah, so finally, we could really start to implement what we had learned from building out these feature files. And we also had a relatively good idea of where we needed to start, as we had already painted a picture of what depends on what. And yeah, just again to break the flow a bit, I just really want to emphasize that it wasn't all sunshines and rainbows. I did mention the anxiety. And if someone had told me even at this point, when we were putting buses on maps, that we were going to scrap the whole BDD thing, I probably would have been okay with it. Obviously, my opinion has changed since then. I mean, that's obviously why I'm giving a talk now. And just really want to highlight that this talk was based in hindsight, and there were challenges. I don't want to paint this picture that BDD is a perfect solution and everything's going to be great once you start using BDD. So anyways, fast forward by a few months. Sorry, it's a DeLorean. I don't know quite. Yeah, whatever. Sorry. We now have a system doing some pretty cool things. But even the best laid plans obviously can sometimes go askew, and some technical changes later to help handle some scaling issues. And we now had a bunch of broken tests, which require some serious restructuring to fix. And these broken tests are actually the reason I'm here today. Not because I'm looking for someone at PyCon to help me fix them, but there was quite a profound moment which happened during this time. I guess it was really like that sort of penny drop moment for me on just how awesome BDD really is. So we had a bunch of failing tests, and usually what that means is useless tests, right? I mean, generally speaking, when the code a test is testing changes, up until the point that the test is updated, the test is sort of useless. I mean, obviously, it still shows an intent to test something, which is useful, but it still needs to be fixed to be completely valuable. But interestingly enough, even though the Python test runner was no longer running, the BDD tests themselves were still useful and relevant. And why was that? Well, because we could still actually run the test, right? Like obviously not programmatically, but we could still take those feature files that we had built and walk through them interactively on what we had built, like, you know, the UIs, etc. And then we ended up doing even more restructuring. And yet, after all these restructures and whatever, later the feature files were never touched. They're still exactly how they are as we wrote them, however many months ago, after all those meetings and discussions and back and forth. They're still exactly the same, and they're still relevant. They're still, as I mentioned earlier, passing in our mind. We can still make them pass in our minds by actually interactively clicking through things and doing things. So yeah, this is where I'd really like to start wrapping things up, and just and where I'd like to encourage you as an audience, if you haven't already tried BDD, to give it a go, even if it's just starting small by looking at something you have already built and looking at how you would define its features and scenarios using just given, when, then. And again, just to highlight, this is surprisingly probably one of the hardest parts of BDD. I mean, the other day there was a discussion between two members of our team, Mava and David, where Mava was frustrated by how hard it is to write these scenarios. And he felt that David does them so effortlessly, which resulted in a chuckle by David, as he knows how hard it is. And like he himself has even said, he has been trying to implement BDD for the last 10 years, which I hope really highlights that there is obviously some hurdles to get through, and that one shouldn't be discouraged if coming up against any of these obstacles. So how are we using BDD now at Afro Labs in a greater sense of it, as obviously we clearly enjoy it, right? So yeah, at Afro Labs, we are excited about BDD and what it potentially means with how we communicate with product development. I think we would still consider ourselves quite fresh in the world of BDD, with a lot still to learn. It really does feel like we're only now just scratching the surface. We have just recently started looking at adopting it across other products, even taking the approach with a sort of lightweight implementation of BDD in the form of only running it through a Google Doc, or even just defining these features in Slack for some clients. Because in theory, that is the core of what makes BDD BDD. I mean, technical and non-technical members of the team coming together to define scenarios and features. The tests underneath are important, yes, but even without them, there's still a lot of value to be had in BDD. Oh, thank you. I think I finished a little bit earlier, but thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you very much. Let's get this even. Okay, I'm going to try this because I think you're really good. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. There's quite a lot of questions and conversation on Discord. I'm going to start with a few easy ones. And then if we don't get to them, please carry on to the Discord channel. And then we can carry on there. There was one question from Jade asking if these are on GitHub. I think someone responded that Behave is on GitHub, but is your specific examples there?
No, they're not. My specific examples are not. I am happy to share them. I think that's actually, thanks, Jade. I think that's a good idea, actually. There's no reason for me not to put this on GitHub. I can share that and I guess just leave a link on the Discord.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then there was one that I thought was probably a very good one. From Benjamin Klaassen, how do you handle new concepts being brought forward later in the project or new expectations? Do you adapt the current tests or write new ones?
Sure. Yeah, I think that is a good question, right? I think the tests themselves, I would almost say you would adapt the existing ones. I mean, this is at least based on my own personal opinion. Reason being is, to me, you shouldn't have feature files that are not actually true in the business context, right? Like, oh, that was 2 months ago what we thought was going to happen. So yes, I do think new concepts should adapt the existing sort of tests that you have, feature files.
Okay. From LJ, how much of the total project time was spent doing BDD phase? It looks like it can really help the poor requirements they struggle with.
Sure. So we started last year, I think, probably sometime around this time. And I would say we probably only really started sinking our teeth into the code in the first quarter of this year. So I'll definitely say maybe the first 2, 3, even maybe 4 months was spent heavily in the world of BDD. We were also obviously like writing out the test, and we were still implementing code, but obviously, like I mentioned, such a thin slice of it, keeping it as lightweight as possible, just so we don't build ourselves in a corner, right? While we're still figuring out all the features. We wanted to make sure we had a very good idea from end to end what it needed to look like before we decided to throw random database at it, to only realize, oh wait, random database is not going to work.
Yeah, and
So,
from my side, I was
time.
trained as an engineer and worked with a lot of social scientists, and I think this attempt at getting people to talk to people, and getting the code in its proper place is so fantastic. So I'm so excited about this. And yes, it does take a lot of time, but then your code is also much more useful. Okay, last question. Then we go to the top again for more questions. From Jonathan Carter, do you still write up any form of specification in addition to BDD?
So sorry. I'm just sorry. There's obviously 10,000 things going in my head now for that question.
Do you want to come back to it later?
Yeah, I feel like it's a very short question, but I feel like I've got a very broad answer potentially, because
sort of like real life doesn't do well with specifications.
Yeah.
All right, let's take that one to Discord. We can take that one further. All right, so from one of the first questions from Sheena, would you use BDD in combination with other tools? For example, maybe normal unit testing on lower level code, or BDD for business cases?
Yes, 100%. I don't think BDD should bully out anything else that you're comfortable with, or any other kind of approach like that. I think it's something that can live in unison. Like I mentioned, you don't even actually need to write the tests, get them passing. I mean, that's great that it's all kind of bundled together, but yeah, we've never felt like, oh, we're using BDD now, we're not going to write any unit tests. Haven't actually wrote any unit tests for Go Metro yet, because we were kind of just powering it all through BDD, but we've had the discussion ourselves, like BDD is great, but we can still use something like unit tests for more, as you mentioned, lower level code.
Yeah. Using any evangelical thing goes against the whole ideology of BDD, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Excuse me. Question from Mark. How dependent is BDD on exact phrasing? And do non-programmers adapt to that?
How dependent is BDD on exact phrasing? It's again, it's a tricky one, right? It's like words are hard, right? And that's what I mean. There is this. It's not that dependent on exact phrasing, but in the same sense, it kind of is.
So you sort of need a
It's a,
facilitator. You can't leave the non-programmers alone with this thing and expect it to work.
well, I don't know. Sorry, I'm often having internal debates with myself when I see things like this. And
I think we need to give you your own channel afterwards. So you have these philosophical debates about
but just in closing, we have actually, and that's the beauty of BDD. We have thrown non-technical people have gotten together and have produced sensible BDD for the developers to actually be like, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So Mark has a follow-up to that. Instead of writing, should they send a notification? They write. Instead of writing should send a notification, they write should have sent a notification and don't understand why it doesn't work. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's not that specific.
Okay.
It's not that specific with regards to its phrasing.
Okay. Imran Mayer asks, in your opinion, when do you think it's a good time to use the BDD approach? Does it depend on the type of feature? You may have answered this.
I think any time's a good time. Any time's a good time to use BDD. You can literally, I mean, you could write a feature file for literally everything. It's just taking the time to get comfortable with it. I think that's the real trick behind BDD. But no, I don't think there's a perfect time to use BDD. I do think you can use BDD anytime.
Okay. And Paul Swart asked, do you use use cases to inform what BDD scenarios to analyze? I guess that sort of adds into the previous one.
So yes, that's definitely, we do obviously have a UX designer who has sort of also built in specific use cases for us, and that also does help power those discussions for the scenarios and features. So yes, it definitely does help sort of move a BDD discussion along with regards to feature files.
Okay. LJ asks, has your company successfully used BDD for a data science or machine learning project?
Short answer, no. Reason being is literally this Go Metro is the first time we've really sort of taken a serious decision to use BDD in all its forms. Like I mentioned, it was a struggle at first, and like I said, David kept us on the straight and narrow. I do see David is also answering questions in the Discord. He probably has better answers than me, so I would definitely ping him up if you do have any other questions.
I'll definitely look into this more. I think it's for the type of work like urbanism work, and which Metro is like the transport layer. I work in water and sanitation and resource flows, and it just becomes so complex. I'm really excited about this. Another question from Dirk Ace: what is the difference between BDD and end-to-end testing?
Yeah, it's obviously another really good question. I mean, I suppose on paper it almost feels pretty much like the same thing, right? I think for me personally, I think BDD is a way to so end-to-end testing. I almost feel like you kind of already need to know what you're doing before you can write an end-to-end test, right? It kind of already kind of needs to be there. Whereas BDD, you can kind of take away all that complexity early on and then define it on paper and then write the test.
Okay. There is another question or follow-up question from Jonathan Carter, but I'm going to read it out, but you don't have to answer it. So he says he can imagine that specifications can be really useful at the costing phase, because BDD does seem to lend itself, it's feature creep if you're already after that phase. So have you used BDD with an external client before? But he says it might be a difficult one, and he can talk to you later.
Yeah, let's definitely pick that up later.
Okay.
Like I said, we're very excited about BDD and we're using it all over the place. Like I said as well, I'm definitely no expert with BDD, and I'm just very excited about it. I just really wanted to share it today.
Thank you very much for sharing. Is there any closing comments, places we can find you, cool links,
Um,
find your Discord?
no, I'm on Discord. Yes, I don't mean no and like don't talk to me. Where I just can't think of
Yes.
any easy way of getting hold of me. But Discord's probably a sensible place.
Well, that's fabulous. I think you're my favorite talk so far. I know I shouldn't have favorites. Great. So we'll end the broadcast there.
Cool,
I
thank
think
you.
next up we have a panel discussion, actually. Educating coders, headed up by Sheena O'Connell. That also sounds very interesting. See you there. Thanks.
Cool, thank you.